Hi, this is Andre. This is the first of a few videos looking at using MIDI to control live looping devices. Now, MIDI can be a big and intimidating subject, but I firmly believe that you can effectively use MIDI for live looping with just a small amount of knowledge about a few of its aspects. The first thing to know about MIDI is that MIDI does not actually transmit any sound. When two or more MIDI devices are connected, there's no audio passing between them. What is being sent are different types of instructions and commands. Now, depending on the type of messages being sent, the type of controller doing the sending, and the device that's receiving the commands, MIDI can be used for a wide variety of functions. For instance, as you'll see in the first demonstration, commands that would normally be used to play notes on a synthesizer can actually be used to turn functions on a looper on and off. Now, there are many different kinds of MIDI commands, but in my experience, there's only really two that you need to know about when it comes to controlling a hardware looper: note messages and continuous controller messages, also known as control change messages or CC messages for short. We're going to be looking at both of those types of commands and some different ways that they can be used for controlling a looper. I'm using the Echoplex Digital Pro in this video for a couple of reasons. One is that it can be configured to use either note commands or continuous controller commands for its functions, which makes it unusually well suited to demonstrate those two types of commands. Also, when using certain MIDI messages, the EDP actually displays the current MIDI value that it's receiving on its front panel, which is fantastic for visualizing how those messages are affecting a loop. A quick note about the controllers in this video. I'm using two devices made by Arturia, the Keystep and the Beatstep. I have no professional relationship with Arturia at all. I'm a regular customer and I paid regular retail prices for both of them. I like the controllers a lot, and for a variety of reasons I find them well suited to demonstrating the concepts we talk about in this video, but there's no professional sponsorship or endorsement going on. After the main demonstrations, there will be some closing thoughts as well as some previews of what we'll be looking at in subsequent MIDI videos. Alright, to start with, we have this MIDI controller plugged into a computer via USB. This is sending information to the computer, and the computer is hosting a software synthesizer. So if we play a note, we get sound. If we move our finger along this modulation strip, we open and close the filter. Now let's look at what's happening here as far as the MIDI commands that are going on, because there are two types of commands happening right now. There are note commands and there are continuous controller commands. So when you press a key, that sends a note on command, and that keeps being sent until you release the key. As soon as you release the key, that sends a note off command. So note on, note off, note on, note off, note on, note off, etc. Each of these different keys has a different note value, and they can be described in a couple of different ways. You can describe this as note number 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, etc. You can also describe this as D2, D sharp 2, E2, F2, F sharp 2, etc. You can either describe it by a note name in an octave range, which is what the 2 in D2 refers to, or you can define it as a raw number. So 38 means that if you count from the lowest possible MIDI note all the way up to the highest possible note, starting with the lowest, this is the 38th note that you get, starting from the lowest possible value you can have. Now, this is sending out a continuous controller message, and continuous control messages send out a range of values. Right now, this is assigned to continuous controller number 1, and controller number 1 in the synthesizer on the computer is connected to the filter. So when the continuous controller is at its maximum value, you get a bright sound. Now, as we move our finger down the modulation strip, we're sending lower and lower values for that continuous controller. And as we get towards the bottom, we're now at the bottom range of that controller's values. So right now we're sending 0 as a value for this continuous controller. If we work our way back up the modulation strip, now the value is slowly increasing. And when we get to the top, now we're sending out a value of 127. 0 to 127 is the possible range of a continuous controller to send. So 0 is the minimum possible value, 127 is the maximum possible value for a continuous controller. What you can also do with a continuous controller is jump to different fixed values. So instead of scrolling through an entire range, you can also just pick one particular value and let it sit there. So right now, I'm just tapping different parts of the control strip. And then instead of moving my finger along it and getting a range of values, I'm just touching it and then letting it go. So that means that the continuous controller is at that fixed value. It's probably about 1/3 of the way up. And it's going to stay there until we send a different continuous control value for that same controller number. Now it's at maximum, that's at 127. Now it's at 0, which is its minimum value. Now we're scrolling through the entire range of the controller. And now we're just jumping randomly to different fixed static values within its range. Alright, so now we have the same controller sending MIDI into the Echoplex Digital Pro, and if we play the same notes that we were just playing now, let's see what happens. Now that note is triggering record on the EDP. That is triggering overdub on and off. That's multiply. And basically all of the different EDP functions can be mapped through MIDI. Each function has its own particular MIDI note assigned, and by sending that note, you can trigger that function. And most of the EDP functions are on-off situations. So you press a function, it turns on, you press it a second time, it turns off. So that correlates really nicely to note on and note off commands. So press it once, we start recording, press it a second time, we stop recording, do a long press, hold the note down, that sends a long press command and erases the loop. Let's record something. Alright. So we have different notes triggering different EDP functions. We also have the modulation strip. This is still transmitting continuous controller number 1. But now the EDP has been configured so that continuous controller number 1 controls the output level of the loop. So if we start at the top of the controller strip range and start bringing it down, you can hear the loop is getting quieter. This doesn't affect the dry live input signal, so that stays intact. Continuous controller 1 is just affecting the output level of the loop itself. And as you can see, it actually shows you exactly what the MIDI value is at any given time, which is a really nice feature. So when you're at maximum volume, that's at 127, which is the maximum value you can have for a continuous controller. When the volume is all the way down, the value is 0 for that continuous controller. And you can also randomly jump to static or fixed values within that range. Now, in addition to using note on and off commands for its functions, the EDP can also use continuous controller commands. So right now, we're going to go to the MIDI row, controller source. Right now it's set to note. If we click it again, now it's set to controller. Off camera, I configured the modulation strip, so now this is sending out continuous controller values for controller number 38, which corresponds to the record function on the EDP. So any positive value above 0 will be considered an on command for that function. There we go. Any value of 0 is considered an off command. As you can see, it's a little erratic, and this is no fault of the Arturia or the EDP or anything else. For an on-off kind of situation, like you would have with a push-button function, using a controller strip like this is not a great way of going about it. So that's the bad news. The good news is that most MIDI controllers will let you assign fixed values for CC commands to different pads or switches, so that instead of having to mess around with this kind of silliness, you can basically just have one pad that sends out a value of 0 if you want to stop the function, and a positive value above 0 to start the function. Let's check that out. Alright, so now we've swapped out the key step for the beat step, And you can see we're also screen sharing the MIDI editor program for the Beatstep. So now all of these pads can be configured to send all kinds of different MIDI commands. And right now this is an empty patch. I have it plugged into the EDP, but as you can see right now we're not sending any commands. We're actually going to configure this from scratch. So we're going to edit this first pad. Right now, as you can see, it's not sending anything. And we're going to come down here. For mode, we want this to send switched control. So it's going to be a continuous controller. The CC number is going to be 38. For the EDP, CC number 38 is the one that's assigned to the record function. So it's already set up the way we need it to. The on value is going to be 127. The off value is going to be 0. So now if we press that first pad, now it's recording. Press it a second time. Now we've stopped recording. So now the behavior is exactly like you would have from a switch, and instead of having to scroll through the entire continuous controller range, you can just jump back and forth between setting a positive value, which activates the record function, and then pressing it a second time switches to 0, which the EDP interprets as the end of a function press. Just like we were using the modulation strip on the Keystep to send values across a range for a continuous controller, we can also use the rotary encoders on the Beatstep to do the same kind of thing. So let's say that we want this rotary encoder to be the loop output volume. Here's the loop I built up off camera. So we're going to assign that to CC number 1 because that's what the EDP has assigned for loop output volume. And now we have this controlling output volume for the loop. What you could also do is configure these pads to send static continuous controller values. So let's say that we wanted this pad to be 50% volume. So we're going to select pad number 9. It needs to be switched control, which it already is. We're going to send the off value to 64 and the on value to 64 as well. And it's going to send controller number 1. So now if we press that pad, now it goes to 50% volume. This is still giving us full control over the entire volume range. That's just giving us 50%. We can also set this up to toggle between different values. So let's have this go between maximum volume and 50% volume. So we're going back to that pad, and let's have the on value be 127. That's going to be the maximum value. Oh, and we're getting a momentary behavior here. So we're going to come over here. Instead of gate, it's going to be toggle. There we go. So now we are toggling between maximum value, which is 127, and 50% volume, which is 64. Let's say we want it to be maximum and completely off. Now we're toggling between 127 and 0. Let's say that we want all of these pads to be different volume levels. So let's have pad 9 be maximum. Let's have pad 10 be 84. Switch control. There we go. And let's have pad 11 be really low, but still kind of audible. 44. There we go. So this is sending out fixed values for that continuous controller. If we want to cover the entire range, we can use the knob, which will sweep all the way from maximum at 127 to minimum at 0. If we want to jump directly to an immediate value, we can program that particular fixed value for that controller number on a pad. And as we've seen, we can also toggle back and forth between values, I'm going to go back to pad 9, and I'm going to set the off value to 0. So now we're toggling back and forth between maximum value at 127 and minimum value of 0, which is completely silent. Let's look at one other detail with using the beat step with note information on the EDP. We have been using CC commands. So control source is set to control. We're going to go back to using notes. And right now, this is an empty bank for the beat step. So we're going to assign this to be our record button again. That means that we have to set that to note command. And the note value for record is D2. MIDI channel 1, because the EDP is on channel 1. So now we have a sus action record. If we change the option from gate to toggle, now we have a toggle-based thing. What's interesting to me is that if I do a long press, I don't get the erase reset functionality. If you do that on the EDP, doing a long press of record resets the loop. We were doing that with the keystep, with the keyboard controller, and we were getting that effect as well. So I'm not totally sure why the beat step isn't doing that. If we go back to gate mode, so again, that's giving us momentary behavior, so it is responding to how long the button's held down for. But typically in my experience, holding down the record function is going to give you a reset, like you would get from here, like I get with the Behringer FCB 1010. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Towards the end, there was a brief mention of MIDI channels. That's a subject we'll go into down the road, but for the time being, you can think of MIDI channels as being like channels on a TV. In order for a MIDI device to receive messages being sent from a controller, both the controller and the target device need to be set to the same MIDI channel. As we've seen, the basic building blocks of note messages and continuous controller commands can be implemented in a lot of different ways. Some of this depends on the specifics of a particular device and which functions it has available for control via MIDI. Some of it also depends on the nature of the MIDI controller you use, because not all controllers can send data in every possible way. Whether or not you actually need a controller with that much flexibility is a whole other issue. The short answer is probably not. The longer answer is one of several things we'll be looking at in subsequent videos. We're going to compare different types of controllers, different ways of sending MIDI messages, the ways in which different specific looping devices use those messages to perform functions, and last but certainly not least, how we go about configuring a controller conceptually once all this technical stuff has been addressed, so that we can treat it like a playable musical instrument. All of this is around the corner, so until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.